Hello everyone. I want to talk to you about this. This is I'll get it over here where you can see it. This is the Supreme Court of the United States official decision on Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Now, if you've seen any news articles or political commentary in the last few days, I'm sure you've heard about it. I'm sure if you've been paying attention to the news since about 2012, when this case first got started in Colorado, that you at least have been passingly aware of it. Now, I'm not going to necessarily go into a lot of depth on the case itself. If you would like to read the decision, I will leave a link to it down in the description below. I actually think it's very worth reading. It's a little bit lengthy. This is double-sided. I think it's about 50 pages or so. But I mean, they're not really that difficult. Now, I went through and I read this decision. I read it very thoroughly. I actually wanted to make sure I understood thoroughly what was being said. So, I've taken notes and highlighted and all that sort of stuff. But that was just for my own sort of ability to frame the subject appropriately. But in reading the court decision, I think the justices made some good points, but I think the decision that was made left off a rather important point, and I think there's a really important philosophical point to be made, maybe even from a sort of psychological perspective, about why this decision was the correct decision, but it was made for the incorrect reason. Now, you can see I've changed my camera angle since the last video I made, and you can see maybe that I've arranged a number of things behind me, and this is because I have a point to make. Okay, so I'm going to show you actually what this looks like. This is just my room. This is sort of my home recording studio / bedroom, but you can see back here, I have a number of instruments. I have my 6-string bass guitar, my 8-string guitar, my 6-string acoustic guitar, and my piano. And up on the wall there, I have a number of geometric sketches that I've made. Just things I've done for fun. So the point I'm making in putting these things out here is that I really want to make it clear that I consider myself to be an artist. Okay, an artist of some kind. I wouldn't necessarily claim that I am a super famous artist or even a very good one, but I am absolutely the sort of creative person who I think has at least some license to discuss artistic expression and the nature of it. And that's really what concerned me about this whole decision. And really this whole situation here. See, the way I've heard the debate framed, and in listening to a number of different people on different sides of the argument, there is on one side of the argument I think, a very valid and very understandable point about equal rights and equal protection for certain people under the law. Now, I understand that at a certain point in our country's history, there were certain groups of people, say black people or even Irish people. Hell, I mean, part of my family is Italian. At some point in the past history, Italians were not allowed to participate in the workplace. They weren't allowed to go and get jobs. They weren't allowed to buy things in stores and places like that. A lot of different groups of people have all had to face that at some point in our country's history. And so I can understand where that concern comes from. I can understand the desire to ensure that every person is given an equal opportunity to participate in society at large without the need for unnecessary discrimination based on their group. I get where that comes from. But this case is not about that. It may have been framed that way, but I don't think it's about that. I think it's about something far more fundamental. And it's going to take a little bit of time to explain this idea, but essentially, what I'm getting at is sort of an existentialist idea that delves a little bit into things like developmental psychology and depth psychology. So I'm going to try to explain these ideas as best I can, and I'm going to stumble through them like I usually do because I don't really do scripts, and I don't really do a lot of editing because I'm kind of lazy about it. So let's see how far we can get. And I want to start really when you think about how your mind views the world and how you think about the world and how you engage in the world. That really starts from birth. It starts from very early on. Now, I do not accept the idea that everything in the world is a societal construct. It's idiotic. It's a stupid idea. Anyone who knows anything about developmental psychology or biology or anything else would immediately discard that idea as the ridiculous garbage tripe that it is. We are born with a certain level of subconscious, let's call it pre-programming, or we could even call it, Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, he calls it pre-wiring in advance of experience. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious. There's a lot of different names for it, but the point is when you are born, a biologist would call it an instinct, right? When you are born, you have a set of notions about the world. They come with you, they are genetic, they are pre-wired into your brain, and there are things that you are just going to do, right? Everyone is born with an in-group preference and an out-group call it anti-preference. Everyone is born with a drive for hunger and for thirst. Everyone is born, with a few notable exceptions, everyone is born more or less with some degree of ability to engage socially with other human beings. Everyone is born with the ability to acquire language in some way and express themselves in a certain way and to think abstractly to varying degrees. You are born, and then you develop. And as you develop, you begin to sort of stretch out. Your mind begins to expand, and it starts to spread out into the world. You start to try to understand the way that the world works. And it's through this process of early childhood to late childhood to adulthood, like young adulthood to middle adulthood to old adulthood, advanced adulthood, however you want to call it, that we begin to understand our place in the world and how we should engage with it. And there's a very specific process that dictates the way that we go about this. Okay, human beings think in a certain way. We think symbolically, we think mythologically, we think religiously. We do not necessarily think logically. Human beings are not very logical, rational creatures. As a matter of fact, rational thought and this sort of hyper-intellectual thinking about the world and thinking about philosophy thing really only became an actual a human phenomenon within the last, say, 300 to 400 years, and that may even be pushing it. The reality is, you think of things symbolically, you think of things mythologically. Okay, and you can look at this in terms of early childhood development. Kids don't know how to speak, but they do know how to communicate using body language. And so right from birth, right from the moment that baby is out of the birth canal and ready to be nursed, right, there's this physiological process that happens after birth, right? The baby is born, the placenta is delivered shortly thereafter, and then almost immediately, the mother needs to start nursing the baby. And the reason for that is that nursing the baby releases oxytocin, which causes a contraction of the uterus, which allows the bleeding to stop. Right? And so if you think 15,000 years ago, before we had medical technology, the way that you stopped a mother from dying was you gave her the baby to breastfeed. And then the mother would breastfeed the baby for about 2 years until the baby was capable of getting up and walking around and eating solid food and taking care of itself to some degree. But there's a thing that starts to happen very, very, very early on, and it's right there. It's right at that moment when that baby comes out. They already have instincts. They have things like the rooting reflex, which is where if you take a baby and you stroke the side of their cheek, they will turn towards the thing that you stroke them with, and they will try to suck on it. And that's so that babies can latch and they can breastfeed. Okay. So babies have that. They also develop the ability to cry fairly early on. They kind of come out with it, right? If you've ever had kids or if you've been around a birth, you know kids tend to scream a lot. But things start happening right there, right? The baby doesn't know how to communicate verbally, but the baby knows how to communicate in an embodied sort of way. The baby can take internal states, compare them to the world outside, and decide whether or not that state is desirable. For instance, I am hungry. There is not food here in front of me. This is undesirable, so I'm going to cry. And so the baby just cries. And it's not something that the baby is consciously understanding, right? There's a subconscious process that's just sort of running. It's this unconscious, I need something, the thing I need is not here, so I must express myself in some physical, embodied way, and then the thing that I need arrives, and I can eat. Or I don't, in which case I begin to express myself a little bit more violently, a little bit more aggressively, which happens if you have a very hungry baby that you've been ignoring for a while. Now, as babies get older, they become toddlers. Excuse me, I'm kind of getting over a head cold here, so I might do that a few more times. As babies get older, they become toddlers. They start to interact with each other. Now, kids work out the social world by playing with each other. This was one of the more profound observations of the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. Now, he noticed that kids went through several different stages, right? So they start off with simple, like sort of independent guided play. You have a baby, you are going to play with the baby, you're going to kind of guide it around, you're going to jingle keys over its head, and it's just going to kind of express itself in a weird sort of way, and it doesn't really know what to do. But after a while, the baby sort of learns how to play on its own, and then it becomes a toddler. So it's about 2 years old. The kid can sort of play by itself. And then they'll start doing this thing called parallel play, where a child will play, and then another child will play, and they'll both be playing their own game. They're not really engaging with each other, but they're playing next to each other, or they're in the same room. And then they'll start to kind of take a look, hey, what are you doing over there? You know, they might not say that, but they'll see, like, hey, what's that kid doing over there? And so then they'll try to engage. And then maybe the other kid will respond, and that kid will sort of engage, and then they'll go back and forth. And so then they start to develop this social ability, right? They start to play with each other. So parallel play becomes cooperative play. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens around age 6 to about age 8 or 9, maybe even 11, depending on the kid, where you can have a whole group of kids who can all play cooperatively. They can all be acting out the rules of some game, and a lot of kids really like pretend play, so they'll play things like house, you know, like you can be mom, you can be dad, you can be the dog, you can be the baby, and then they'll sort of negotiate that, and then they'll act out something that they've seen, and so they'll pretend play in a way that helps them to make sense of the world. But if you were to grab a kid who was in the middle of that, around age 6, and pull them out of the group and ask them to explain the game to you, they can't do it. They genuinely cannot do it because they don't understand what they're doing. They can physically embody the game in sort of a symbolic, mythological way, but they cannot express it consciously. And so you send the kid back into the group, and then you grab another kid, and they'll come out, they'll give you a totally different explanation that makes no sense whatsoever. And then you send them back into the group, and you notice that they can all continue to play the game. They can all play the game perfectly fine. Now, once the kid gets to about 11, 14, 16, I mean, obviously by the time they're 16, but once they get to about 9 to 11, they can begin to actually express the rules of the game to you. They can tell you, oh, this is how we play the game. I tag Johnny, Johnny's it, I run away from Johnny, and Johnny chases me and tags me. Or, you know, no tag backs or however else you wanted to play tag when you were a kid. And then kids get to a point age 13, 14, 16, 20, and so on and so forth, where they learn that they are capable of actually creating the rules to the game, and that they can make up games, they can modify games, they can negotiate, and they can try things, right? So what's happening in this situation? Well, what's happening in this situation is that kids are engaging in a world that they don't understand. Right? Human beings engage in this tremendous universe, this massive world that we do not comprehend. And we're trying to make sense of it as best as we can. The problem is we're very small, we're very limited. I mean, look at the size of me compared to just the size of the room I'm sitting in. And you can see, I'm a fairly small guy. I'm not small in terms of human. I'm about 6 foot tall and about 175 pounds. But 6 foot tall and 175 pound stack of meat is not very much when you stack it up against the size of, say, an entire planet or a cosmic universe, right? I'm a very small thing, just a little piece of talking meat sort of running around on a planet for a couple hours in cosmic time, and then I'm gone. Off into the ether I go, and who knows what happens after that. So for the brief little bit of time that this electric meat body is sort of running around, I'm trying my best to make sense of the world. A huge world that doesn't care about me at all, that seems to behave in really random and unpredictable and distressing sort of ways. Right? The world is complicated. It's hard. There's things that go on in my own brain that I don't understand, and that's really what the depth psychologists were getting at, Carl Jung, Freud, and Alfred Adler, and all the rest of them. They would say, you have a subconscious mind. There's stuff inside your own skull that you don't understand, and no matter how hard you try to understand it, you can't. And so, as much as I might try to express those things verbally, I can't. And so you're left with the next best thing. See, just like when you're a kid and you're trying to make sense of the world around you, you're trying to make sense of mom and dad and your home relationship and your friendships and school and everything else, you start to pretend play, you act things out, you draw pictures, you sing songs, you make dances, you do all kinds of different things. Human beings fundamentally are expressive creatures who think in mythological and religious sorts of patterns. This kind of creative endeavor, drawing, music, writing, speaking even, all of these are things that we engage in socially so that we can try to make sense of the world together. And we're doing it badly, and we're always going to do it badly. I mean, you look at a kid playing house, okay? If you sit down and you really watch a group of kids play house, you're going to become really aware in the space of about 2 minutes that kids have no idea how the hell your house works. Right? You're like, I'm never going to let those kids run a house. That's not what house is like at all. Well, no, of course a 6-year-old can't play house in a sensible way. You're 27 and you're just now learning how to play house correctly. And if you look around my room, I'm a 27-year-old who's, not doing all that great at playing house because I've got a robe tacked to my wall because I can't seem to figure out how to buy curtains. I digress. The point is, when you are trying to make sense of the world, you're going to do it symbolically. You're going to do it through artistic expression. You're going to do it through speech, music, drawing, painting, baking, sculpture, all kinds of things, okay? And it's very important. It's it's vitally important as a human being that you engage in those things as honestly as possible. And that's a subject that I could probably go on at length for. You're going to have to take my word for it. If you engage in your expressive things, your expressive, let's call it sense-making, as honestly as possible, then what you're going to find is that the reality that you begin to understand from all of these strange, disparate mythological representations that you're creating starts to make sense, and it is congruent with the reality in which you live. If you lie, or if you make dishonest statements, if you produce a lot of dishonest art, basically if you're a sellout, if you want to call it that, if you make expressive statements that you know are untrue, or that you fully believe are untrue, you're betraying a piece of yourself. You are changing yourself. You're also doing that when you're honest. Okay, that's really the way it is. When you're engaging in things in this symbolic sort of way, you are changing yourself, slowly but surely. Every time you say something, you're changing a little something in your brain, right? You're trying to rewire, you're trying to retool something in your brain. Every time you play a piece of music, you get a little bit better at it. You get a little bit better at it. You get a little closer to that perfect reality that you're never really going to attain. But slowly, as you're doing that, you're also fundamentally remaking yourself. When you make a piece of art that expresses something about the world, what you're really doing is you're taking a subconscious piece of your mind, you're taking a part of your soul, and you're putting it out into the world, and you're trying to shape it in accordance with the reality that you see. And in doing so, you are fundamentally changing yourself as a person. It's a thing that happens. You are not simply making the thing. The thing that you are making is also making you. And so it's very important to do things honestly. Now, this is to say nothing about the decision that Mr. Phillips made in regards to whether or not he was going to bake the cake for the couple who came and requested it. I have some concerns for Mr. Phillips. I would wonder, why do you think that same-sex marriage is not okay? But that's up to him. He has to decide that, okay? I don't personally have an issue with same-sex marriage. Personally, actually, I think from a political point of view, the government should just get the hell out of marriage in general. Marriage has generally been regarded as a religious and societal institution, and the government being involved in incentivizing people to, say, have children and settle down is a very strange idea to me. However, I digress again. The point that I'm making here in this sort of long and rambling pseudo-intellectual discussion is that Mr. Phillips refused to sacrifice his artistic integrity. That was the decision that he made. Now, there are people who are saying, oh, well, he was discriminating against them because of their sexual orientation. That argument doesn't work. Okay, I'm sorry, that argument is incorrect. First of all, he did not say that he would not serve them at all. He said that he would not participate in a same-sex wedding. So he had an issue with the wedding as a whole. Secondly, the day after this couple came and asked him to bake the cake, and he said no, the mother of one of those gentlemen came and asked him to bake the same cake for the same wedding, and he said no. Presumably, at that point, he was assuming at the very least a bisexual and most likely a heterosexual female customer who was requesting a cake for a same-sex wedding, and he refused to do that for her as well. So it had nothing to do with the sexual orientation of the requester. It had everything to do with the actual ceremony itself, which he felt was a fundamental violation of the things that he believes. Now, I'm not endorsing his religious beliefs. I'm not endorsing any of that. That's a very complicated discussion for another day. What I'm getting at here is this. Mr. Phillips decided on the basis of artistic integrity that he would not produce a piece of art that he did not believe in, because he did not want to produce a piece of art that would cause a fundamental change in his being, within his soul, within his subconscious mind, that he was not prepared to accept. I think that's a perfectly valid decision to make. Now, do I agree with his decision? Maybe not. I certainly wouldn't do that in his position. I would just bake the damn cake, because, well, you already know my opinion on all of that. However, the decision that was made was correct, but it was made for the wrong reasons. The decision that was made was essentially that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission didn't use the appropriate neutrality in approaching the case, and they presumed that Mr. Phillips' religious beliefs were reprehensible, and this was demonstrable in some of their uncontested commentary throughout various different court cases, and the fact that they were comparing his religious beliefs to things that had justified slavery and the Holocaust and so on and so forth. So that's a thing that you could think about, and I think that's a valid concern. However, the most important concern for me is that of artistic integrity. It is vital that we as a country, that we as a society understand something about art, and that is that art is not simply the production of something tangible. It's not. And if you think it is, well, you're kind of unconscious, and you need to open your eyes a little bit and pay attention to what you're actually doing. And it doesn't really matter what you say you consciously believe. What I care about is actually your actions, the way you behave in the world, because your actions will betray what you actually believe. And I promise you, every single person who is watching this believes and acts in the world as though art is this very powerful sort of transformative substance. Why else would you go to an art museum? You wouldn't. You would not go to an art museum to see some old dead guy's paintings on the wall, unless in some physical, unconscious, embodied way you understood the significance of that piece of art, that this was not simply somebody slapping a bunch of molecules over a bunch of other molecules that suddenly made a canvas that looks like some lady who has no eyebrows. You would understand that that canvas is the physical manifestation of an unconscious process wherein a human being, a soul, a conscious mind and an unconscious mind had a brief meeting and were able to sort of make sense of something about the world that was strange and new and exciting. And in this process, this human being was able to transform himself or herself and the world around them. That's what art is, and that's why artistic integrity is so important. And that's why I think in this case, we're talking about Mr. Phillips. Regardless of what you think about his beliefs, the fact of the matter is the man has artistic integrity. He decided that he was going to stay congruent with his beliefs. And if you want to change his mind, if you want to change who he is as a person, you cannot do that by fiat. If you come to me as an artist and you ask me to make a piece of art that violates a personal or fundamental belief of mine, I'm not going to do it. And I'm not going to do it because I don't want to set myself up in this strange cognitive dissonance where I'm beginning this transformation process in a direction that I'm not comfortable with. So if you want to change somebody like Mr. Phillips, if you want to approach them and get them to change their mind, you have to do it in a different way. You have to allow them to arrive at a certain place where they're capable of making that transformation themselves if they are ready to do so. And you might also want to examine whether or not the transformation you want them to make is the correct one. Maybe you don't know what the correct decision would be in that situation. You have to be careful in these things. So I suppose to summarize this very long and rambling rant here, artistic integrity is very important. It's very important that we understand as human beings that when we participate in the creative act, when we participate in writing or baking or making art, especially things that are significant to us, things that we consider meaningful, that we are engaging in a process of self-transformation wherein we are trying to make sense of the world around us. And we have to do that carefully. We have to do that with much respect and with much careful understanding of the sheer spiritual power of this engagement. It is a powerful thing, and it's not a thing that you can simply dismiss as commerce or a money-making enterprise, because if you do so, you sell your soul, and you damage yourself, and you damage your society. I don't know if any of that makes sense. Hopefully it does. Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.